This is the Building Energy Performance Standard Task Force meeting for July 7th, 2020, starting at 2:30 p.m. This meeting is being recorded and will be posted on our website. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. In just a minute, for those folks that are new to Blue Jeans, we'll do a little tour just so you can know where all of the controls are. We do usually have a pretty active chat box, and we're going to be using that a lot for today's conversation. So in just a couple slides, we'll go through that. Let me get started. So for questions and comments throughout the meeting, I'm only going to mute people for background noise. So everybody controls their own mute. I think everybody's used to video conferencing by now. So I'll let you control your own mute. But what we do ask is, because we are going to have a lot of people on the call today, task force members can just speak when you need to speak or feel like you need to speak, but non-task force members, please use the chat box pretty heavily. We will be facilitating the chat box and calling on people to elaborate or speak when they put their thoughts and information in the chat box. That also helps us take notes for the meetings. So if you are a non-task force member while we were talking about a conversation, please use the chat box if you would like to speak, and then we will pull out different folks to be able to speak at different times throughout the meeting. For the non-task force members, please use the chat box at this time to go ahead and sign in. If you'll put your name, your organization, and your email, and then just press enter. For the task force members, Andrew is going to do our normal roll call.
All right, let's go through the list. We'll just do normal order this time. Katie Bergfeld, who I know is joining us late, so skip her. Patty Boyd.
Yep, Patty's here. Sorry.
And sorry, no, just say here present. I forgot my usual spiel. Jen Croft, I believe, is also going to be late. Marshall Dewar-Balkin.
Present.
You, Wendell Felder. Asa Foss. Dave Good. No. Max Greninger.
Here.
Adrian Gross.
Here.
Rush Mahala.
Present.
You. Jessica Jones. Annika Landrinow.
Here.
Cliff Majerzik. Todd Nedwick. Matt Praske.
Here.
Joe Riley.
I was on mute. I'm here.
Okay, good.
Andrew, this is Dave as well. My audio was messed up, but I'm present as well.
I saw your videos. I was already marking you at present. Joe, you on? Okay, and then Jay Wilson.
Yep. Good afternoon. I'm here.
We have a quorum. Okay, thank you very much. Quick tour of Blue Jeans. Up at the top, so we're Zoom where all of your controls are at the bottom. In Blue Jeans, they're at the top. The very first button up in the middle on the left is your video control. The second one is your audio control. If you are having bandwidth issues, I would suggest turning off video and possibly switching to phone control. If you want to go through phone audio instead of computer audio, all you have to do is click the little down arrow next to the microphone, and it will give you the phone number to be able to call in and switch over to phone audio. The button right next to that is a little computer screen. That is to share your screen, and I should be the only one doing that today. The red button right next to that is to hang up and leave the meeting, so don't do that until the end. On the right-hand side are the control panel. So if you click on people, it will open up the list of all of the people that are on the call. If you click on the chat button, it's going to open up the chat box, and make sure that when you're chatting to have the thing that says everyone in blue highlighted to make sure that your message is going to everyone. You're welcome to do direct messages to a particular person, but make sure that when you're chatting to the whole group that everyone is highlighted. If you're having issues with your audio, I would suggest clicking on settings and looking at your camera, your microphone, or your speaker settings. Also, to make sure that everything on the screen fits into your screen for the slides and for your video. If you click on the little button that says Fit Video to View and or Always Show Video and Layout Controls, those are two little boxes that are actually very handy to be able to make everything fit on the screen properly. So that's your tour of BlueJeans. If you have any issues, you can always send me a direct message and we can go from there. Yeah. So the role of the task force is to advise DOEE on the creation of an implementation plan for the Building Energy Performance Program. It's to recommend amendments to proposed regulations issued by the DOEE and to recommend complementary programs or policies. If a topic needs in-depth discussion, anyone can suggest moving it to a subcommittee. And this is an open meeting. Everyone is allowed to participate. Today's topic that we were talking about is actually for solar was one that we were suggesting to move to a subcommittee, but because the majority of the task force wanted to talk about it, it actually stayed at committee level instead of going to a subcommittee. So our overall schedule, we just like to review this every time for the next 4 to 5 months until the program goes live. We have a list of things that we keep running of future agenda items. We'll be talking about the task force report in a couple of months. We'll probably in the next month or so talk at length about the cost benefit study and the prescriptive path. We'll be coming back to the task force for feedback on our guidance documents. We may have some feedback sessions on the hub, possibly with the Green Bank and BCSEU, and on the agenda possibly for next time is disclosure of BEPS data. So we will keep this running list of future agenda items. So our agenda for today is our administrative items that we just went through. We're going to do a quick subcommittee update for our campus subcommittee, and then today is all about solar, part 2. So we're going to go through, in our solar section, we're going to go through kind of a very quick review of what we talked about on June 23rd, just in case we have some new people that didn't make that meeting, and then we'll go into the new content. So we'll do a really quick subcommittee update, and I'll do that for you. Our campus subcommittee for the campus standard has not met yet. We've actually spent a little time just putting the committee together, finding out who's going to be on it, and scheduling the first meeting. So the first meeting is going to be next Wednesday, July 15th at 1 p.m. It's going to be about an hour and a half. We have about 20-ish people signed up for it. A very large percentage of that are from our university consortium here in DC. And then we have several task force members and a couple other technical support people from the outside that we're bringing in to help us with this topic. So if anybody is interested in participating in the campus subcommittee, please send me an email or send me a note in the chat box, and I'll send you my email so that you can tell me if you're interested. And then I will kick off and hand it over to Andrew to do the review of solar.
Awesome. Thank you, Sharon. So these first couple slides are going to be pretty much a review of what we covered 2 weeks ago. I'm just going to run through them again so we're all on the same page, and then we'll dive into, we'll start with our kind of DOE's current thinking about how solar will play in with BEPS, and then we'll go into some analysis that we've done, and then we'll revisit our position statement for open discussion. So what you're seeing here is pretty similar to what we saw. It's just an outline of the two major kind of solar structures we see in the district. The first are net metering systems, NEMs. You'll hear me say NEMs a million times during this presentation, and community renewable energy facility, a CREF. And the main difference between these two is where the solar actually sits for the building, whether it is behind the meter or in front of the meter. A NEM sits behind the meter and primarily services the host site, whereas a CREF sits in front of the meter and directly produces energy to the grid regardless of the building's host site. I'll just also echo what Sharon said in the chat, which is major kudos to Marshall Durwelkin for coming up with these graphics. I can't imagine how many hours he spent on these. Next slide. Sharon, do I have control or you? Oh, there we go, thanks. So yeah, and then kind of talking a little bit more about some of the different structures and incentives and how solar works. What's a PPA? A PPA is a power purchase agreement. It's the agreement between one customer and a renewable resource to offtake a large amount of energy produced by a system. This can be, a PPA can be in reference to a energy source that is far away from the host site, but still on the grid. It can also be something that is sitting on top of a building, feeding that exact building. It's a financial agreement for the energy produced from the renewable installation. And then what is an SREC? These are renewable energy credits specific for solar that are market-based instruments to represent property rights to the non-energy benefits, non-power attributes of that renewable generation, usually equals about 1 megawatt hour. And these come about because of the district's RPS, Renewable Portfolio Standard, which is part of the reason why we have such a strong SREC market. Our goal is 100% RPS by 2032 and a 10% solar carve out by 2041 or 2. Someone can correct me in the chat on the exact date. Next slide. Okay, and then I wanted to kind of go over our goals again and the concept of deep decarbonization, since this is really the backdrop for this entire conversation. Clean Energy DC Plan is our implementation plan of the 2032 goals of sustainable DC. The first is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 50%, then reduce energy consumption per capita by 50%, and then increase renewable energy by 50%. And then now 100, but that's 100% RPS, not 100% renewables by 2032. And then all these goals do feed into the top goal of reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, but the kind of idea of deep decarbonization to achieve that 50% in the most optimal manner, you need to have kind of these three other concepts below, which is first you have to have high levels of efficiency, then you'll decarbonize the electricity supply, and then you will electrify all end-use systems. And that's it's the basic principles of deep decarbonization. So we are kind of following this mission statement of without focusing on implementing efficiency first, deep decarbonization becomes costly and hard to implement. That's why the DC has two programs to focus on this. The first is BEPS, which is to deal with the actual efficiency side of the equation, and then the RPS, which is going to tackle the supply side. So there are two separate programs going after two separate goals in the Clean Energy DC Plan, but all feeding into making that first goal, that 50% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, achievable. Next slide. Okay, and then I want to give a quick overview of how BEPS and solar work under our current paradigm. So there's two ways. The first is when actually calculating the Energy Star score. So in Portfolio Manager, under our current EPA guidance, on-site non-combustible renewables, think a solar installation on a multifamily building, think a wind farm on a multifamily building. None of those exist right now, but let's say they do in the district. That will reduce a building's source energy consumption number. And that's the main input for the Energy Star score. So a building with a solar array on the roof will see an increase in their score if they use that energy from that array on site, regardless of their SREC ownership. There's also this kind of broader concept of source site factors, which I'm not going to talk too much about, but it's the idea that the more renewables we have on the grid, the less production losses we see from electric generating sources, and therefore our electric grid looks more efficient as a result. So that'll raise the scores of all electric buildings, or mostly electric buildings, as more renewables come online onto the grid. And then so because the score is the determinant of whether or not your building is required to do a compliance pathway under BEPS by 2026, having on-site renewables will increase your score and help you avoid having to follow a compliance pathway. But let's say, for example, if you are below the BEPS and you don't have solar, or you did have solar and you're below the BEPS, either way, there's three ways solar can help you. First is the standard target pathway. So for all buildings that their property type's above the national median, this is most buildings in the district, office, hotel, multifamily, will likely all be able to partake in this pathway. They can raise their score to whatever the BEPS was at the beginning of the BEPS period, and they will be in compliance. So this allows them to count on-site solar. The other idea is you can sell SRECs or sell energy from a CREF to help finance efficiency upgrades. As we kind of alluded to earlier, DC has the most lucrative SREC market in the country. This seems like a natural synergy to us. And then also installing solar can be easily paired with other major efficiency measures like a roof replacement. So the idea that installing solar does not inhibit a building's ability to install efficiency measures and vice versa, really. Next slide. Okay, so this is the DOE's position on BEPS and solar. I'm just going to go through this again. We're going to talk about this slide, then go into some analysis that we've done, and then we'll come back to the slide. So we'll have open discussion on the slide. We just want to frame the conversation around this. And as we go through, I think, Sharon, we're going to have people try to put comments in the chat. Am I correct?
Yes.
Yes.
So if you have, we have probably about 4 or 5 slides. What we, like Andrew just said, we wanted to kind of frame our conversation, but then we do have some analysis that everybody asked for on our June 23rd meeting that we want to be able to present. So if while you have questions, or if you have questions on each slide, we're going to go ahead and get through the slides. We think that would be a little bit more efficient use of time. So go ahead and put your questions or comments in the chat box, and then we can always revisit the slide when we get to our feedback session, our conversation, and then we can have as long of a conversation and revisit the slides as much as we want to. Thanks, Andrew.
Yeah, thank you, Sharon. Okay, so I'll run through these pretty quickly, but they're pretty straightforward. The first is obviously to meet our 2032 goals, DOE feels the district needs a program that ensures an efficiency-first approach. So our goal is to keep BEPS primarily focused on demand reduction. And this is to serve 2 purposes. The first is to enable that RPS and the 10% solar carve out. And the second is carbon neutrality. And then BEPS already includes some amount of solar through the Energy Star guidance. Again, kind of what I covered earlier, but you can use solar to meet the standard at the beginning of a compliance period, but you can also use it to meet the local median for property types above the national median through the standard target pathway. Our current feeling is that BEPS does not disincentivize buildings from installing solar. We are not requiring that a building owner retire or sell the RECs to claim that on-site solar benefit. And then we've also found that installing solar does not inhibit its abilities to install efficiency measures or vice versa. And then this is kind of the last point, is that the district already has a number of solar incentives that we've laid out. DOE's Solar for All program is one to note, but then also the RPS plus the carve out, which enables that really thriving SREC market. All right, let's go into the analysis now. So this kind of comes off of what we talked about 2 weeks ago about people wanting to get a sense of the landscape of solar currently in the district as it applies to BEPS. And then we also wanted to really separate this conversation between the 2 types of solar you might see installed. So we're going to talk first about CREFs, then we're going to talk about NEMs more in depth. So first, to talk about CREFs, we looked at the Public Service Commission data on install capacity currently in the district. We cross-referenced it with our benchmarked buildings, and we found that there are about 90 CREFs in the district that are on benchmark buildings. about 4.5% of the total benchmarked buildings. And then looking at the 2018 medians that are published on our website, we found that 30 of those buildings are not going to meet the first round of BEPS. And then this is kind of going back to our original position, but our feeling is that since CREFs sit in front of a buildings meter and they don't count toward a building energy profile, either in a positive or negative way, and that BEPS is not placing any sort of restrictions on a building's installing a CREF, we don't plan to account for CREFs and BEPS. We understand that there might be concern about an incentive about whether to install a CREF or a NEM, and our kind of suggestion is that to allow us to keep coordinating with our Solar for All community and our Solar for All program administrators that work, well, when we were in the office, worked right around the corner from us, but we'll make sure that the programs are aligned on our end to avoid any sort of misincentives. And then, I'm sorry, I left out some information. I didn't put this on the slide, but I have this in the back of my pocket. Yeah, just to give a little bit more clarity on those 90 CREFs, 41% of them are multifamily, 17% are K through 12. Those are the two biggest chunks. And then of those, 13% of the multifamily CREFs would be subject to BEPS and 7% of the K through 12. So really pretty small numbers here we're talking. Okay, next slide. All right, let's talk about NEMs and set the picture here. So kind of pretty similar numbers, actually. There's about 70 NEMs on benchmarked buildings. It's about 3.5%. And then of those, 67% are K-12 schools, kind of unsurprising. 10% are multifamily, 10% are office. And then 20 of those NEMs will not meet BEPS. Of the K-12 NEMs, 27 will be subject to BEPS, 4% office, and 0% multifamily. So none of the multifamily NEMs are going to be subject to BEPS. And then we were able to run some analysis to basically figure out what the impact of solar is on these buildings, what they're getting a benefit for in terms of their Energy Star score. And we found that the median benefit is about plus 3 points. And the average is about 5. We use the median because it's kind of being skewed by a lot of the K-12 schools, which do tend to see a larger benefit from having an on-site solar. And then we also found that like 4 buildings or so are able to meet BEPS meet the initial BEPS standard because they have solar. So if they were to take the solar off and just consume that energy normally, they would likely fall below the standard. But it's, again, about 4 buildings, it's a very small portion of this population. And so it's kind of similar, or kind of in light of all this, because the impact of solar installation is so marginal, DOE feels that like keeping in line with Energy Star guidance preserves the intent of BEPS as a demand reduction program. And I'll talk a little bit more on the next slide about Energy Star guidance. And this is also, so I just want to talk about kind of how we feel about Energy Star guidance and how we feel it relates to this. We've mentioned this in the past when we're discussing things about how we want to be following Energy Star guidance whenever possible. We're doing this with occupancy thresholds. And so we generally feel what's on the slide that we should be following Energy Star guidance when accounting for renewables whenever possible. The integrity of the Energy Star program as an industry standard is the basis of BEPS, so deviating from this could cause confusion, could hurt the integrity of BEPS. We just want to make sure we're adhering as close as possible to this national standard as we can. And then to go even a little bit further, we wanted to look kind of at what the scope of the impact would be if we were to deviate. So we were able to estimate the impact if every building in the district installed a solar system, a net metered solar system that would meet like their building specification. And so we found that the aggregated demand reduction savings loss would be about 135,000 megawatt hours. This is about 47,000 tons of carbon emissions. That's obviously everyone, so we just wanted to kind of vary test that, and we looked at a 25 to 75% penetration rate. This came out to about 30,000 to 100,000 megawatt hours and 10 to 35,000 tons of carbon emissions. And so it's from our viewpoint that this energy, this demand reduction savings, equals greenhouse gas emissions lost, since the RPS is already going to ensure that there is renewable development and that these greenhouse gas emissions, the 10 to 35 to 47, are already realized. And then we also feel that the district is more likely to meet our solar carve-out if BEPS is successful at reducing energy demand. So instead of just giving up on these demand reduction savings, this will make both our greenhouse gas goals easier to achieve and also our local solar carve-out. The other thing here to note is that we estimated what the impact on BEPS compliance this would have. So this solar that we're installing on these buildings would constitute anywhere from 0.3 to 150% of total site energy. So there's a big range. The average is about 32%, the median is 8%. So it's a pretty lopsided distribution. And we felt that if we were to count solar as a demand reduction resource, a small number of buildings would be able to comply by installing solar without making efficiency upgrades. And so we viewed this as a fairness issue. We also viewed this as just something we'd like to avoid. So this kind of cues into our next slide, but DOE doesn't plan to deviate from how Energy Star counts NEMs, but we do want to study the implications of solar on building performance. And since we have the legal requirement to study this by 2023, switching to a GHG metric, we plan to study the role of solar at that point. Next slide. Okay, and so we're back to our position slide. So I don't need to read through this again, but I just kind of want to sum this all up and say that the basis of our analysis, based on our analysis, we're planning to continue to follow the intent of the legislation, and we'll plan to evaluate compliance for the performance path based on site energy, and the prescriptive path based on specific energy conservation measures, not accounting for solar in either of those pathways and only allowing it for the standard target pathway and for when a building is compared to the standard for whether or not they have to actually complete a pathway. I think that brings us to the end. I guess the other thing we'll note at this point is that the hope here is that this isn't necessarily a rules affecting item. We can deal with this if we get a lot of feedback that we need to consider. We can deal with this outside of the rules and as an implementation question. So this conversation doesn't need to affect our timeline for publishing the rules. I just want to set that context.
Yeah, this can go into guidance documents, instead of affecting our rules timeline. The chat box was super quiet. Thank you, Andrew, for going through all that information. And that was a lot of information to throw at everyone. So first, I'd like to ask if there is any, before we open it up for feedback, is there any clarifying questions? Does anybody need more information about the information that was presented on any of the slides? A little bit more clarification, they didn't understand something like that. Okay, just wanted to make sure before we open it up for feedback. And because the chat box was super quiet, I wanted to kind of let our co-chairs, Marshall, Matt, and Annika, kind of open the floor for you three to kind of maybe kick us off, and then we'll go from there.
Well, first off, I see a question from Asa that probably in the chat box.
Thank you, Asa. Yeah, so as part of the question is, can you remind us what the 10% solar carve-out is? Of course we can. So as part of the Clean Energy Omnibus Act of 2018, that established a 100% renewable portfolio standard for the district. That means that all the electricity that is coming into the district by 2032 must be from 100% renewable sources. Council dictated that 10% of that energy must be coming from local, within the district boundaries, solar installations. So that's where that 10% comes from.
I guess I would just ask, is everyone clear on how solar is already included in, when you're reporting your building performance metrics every year through benchmarking, if you already have solar on your building or you're putting it on your building during, any given cycle and reporting your building information? Is everyone clear on how it is included, but how it's when it is included and when it's not included? That might be a good place to start, just to make sure everyone sort of understands how where you've drawn the line and how it counts and doesn't count. If no one's raising their hand or speaking up, I'm assuming that means everyone is completely clear and you've done a great. Let's see.
ASA wants to know.
Okay.
Yeah. So to clarify, so solar, if it is on your building and you're using that energy on site, will reduce your source energy consumption. That's because it's not subject to the traditional transmission and distribution losses that are associated with grid provided electricity. So as a result of your source energy being lower, your Energy Star score might be higher because you are performing on a source level better than your national peers. So this affects BEPS in two ways. The first is that since the standard is going to be in terms of the Energy Star score, having a higher Energy Star score will mean that you are less likely to have to make energy reductions or meet one of those compliance pathways by 2026. So if you are above the standard in 2019, then you are basically above the standard. You don't have to do anything until 2027, maybe. You're just kind of let off. Then if, let's say you don't meet that standard, let's say you didn't have solar, you were below the standard, but let's say not by much, there's a pathway available to buildings that belong to a property type group where the standard is above the national median. So for offices, the standard's in the mid to high 60s. That's above the national median, which is 50. Therefore, offices can use this pathway. And therefore, you could install solar on your office building, use that energy on site, and then you will see a boost to your score. And if you are able to meet the standard from the beginning of the BEPS period, then you are in compliance. Otherwise, the other available pathways are the regular performance pathway, which means you have to do a 20% reduction in site energy consumption. Solar will not impact that pathway. And the prescriptive pathway, which is to implement a number of cost-effective energy conservation measures. And right now our plan is to not include solar in the prescriptive pathway.
So I'm wondering if maybe in order to tee up this conversation and start to tease out, I think there are some important distinctions here between CREFs and NEMs and the different reasons that those types of systems end up at different properties. So maybe to tee up this conversation, it's helpful for some of the property owners here to talk through why we might end up with one system at a site over another, or that structure of an on-site solar at one site or another. So curious if anyone wants to sort of chime in with some of the reasons. I'll toss out one for multifamily or retail sites where we may be more incentivized to end up with a CREF because the owner's house account, either the common area lighting on a retail site or just the common area that we have responsibility for and metered for in a multifamily where the residents are maybe direct billed, relatively small. And so if the on-site solar could produce more than that, we may end up with a CREF in order to have find subscribers to use the rest of that energy. So that's a decision that's made totally independent of a demand reduction or energy efficiency thing related to BEPS. It's entirely an operational thing due to some site constraints.
And if I could
Other
add,
reasons,
sorry, if I could just add to Matt's point, just to make sure everyone's on the same page, if your solar installation is dramatically larger in terms of the output of energy than the house account, it won't get permitted as a NEM in the first place, because the net out a NEM is intended that the net outflow isn't massively exceeding the inflow. So if you're in a situation, a multifamily or a retail situation where the house meter, the common area meter is very small and most of the energy use is in the units, you may have a lot of roof area, but you actually literally, a NEM that fully takes advantage of that roof area is not available to you as an option, and the CREF provides that option. And I'll just say I'm not a building owner, but I know I've advised multifamily building owners in DC or other jurisdictions to look at a CREF as a way to supply energy to their residents or the retail tenants, etc., in lieu of net metering, when you have all these separate meters and you can't get a net meter account and you can't actually flow the energy directly to all of those units with separate meters, because that would be very, very expensive. Any other building owners or folks here who have used CREFs who want to speak about what the thing? I do agree with Matt that I think it would be useful. The way DOE has teased this up in terms of NEMs versus CREFs is partially because right now a CREF wouldn't count in any way, regardless, full stop, doesn't thing, whereas a NEM counts in some ways and not others. And so that does create an incentive where people have the ability to do both, to put a NEM on, and it also, to some extent, I think, penalizes folks for whom a NEM isn't an option. So, curious if there's any other CREF users here who could want to speak to that.
Really quickly, hi everyone, this is Alex with DOEE. I just wanted to update folks from a regulatory perspective that there are plans to raise the NEM cap 20% per year over the next 5 years, from 100% of annual consumption up to 200%. Will probably be released from the Public Service Commission as a notice of proposed rulemaking, and there will be a period to comment on that. So just
Alex, while we have you on the line talking about regulatory updates, are you able to provide any color on something we heard about a little bit in the last call, but I feel like folks, I'll speak for myself, I don't fully understand, about the idea of the PSC allowing some CREFs to actually sit technologically behind a meter, and how that works and what that would look like? So
I can.
Not to completely confuse the distinction that's been drawn here, but
it won't. So that's a good question. That doesn't have really much of an impact on this, because CREFs are always going to be front of the meter. Whether or not that's done through a little bit of a gimmick, or whether it's done physically, doesn't really change how the CREFs will work, how they'll be billed, etc. So in terms of a timeline of when CREF developers can start to benefit from that, I would say maybe in a couple of years, but I'm not sure about what the time frame for that is either.
Okay, but technologically, even if the CREF meter, generation meter, might sit behind the regular meter, but the utilities are going to just sort of cancel it out, so that from the perspective of a building owner, it looks like it's in front of the meter, and the data they would be getting put in Portfolio Manager would be in front of the meter.
Exactly. So they won't see it. It won't show up on any bills that are received from PEPCO.
Yeah. It's a little complicated with the aggregation of data because PEPCO, as if I remember correctly, does the sort of aggregation of data. If you get aggregated whole building data, that's done based on the smart meter data, sort of pre-billing structure. So I don't really know how that will end up.
Well,
playing out,
they'll place multiple meters at the site. So they would have a customer generation meter to log everything with the solar. So they'll treat it exactly the same way as a physical front of the meter connection. But they haven't set up any like actual billing software to handle that yet. So I'm not sure I'm not sure like what the timeline is for that. I would expect it to move very slowly.
So I think that's helpful to know that that cap is going up, but is then also useful to point out some of the other reason some owners of properties might still end up with a CREF, which, and if there's anyone on the call who might want to speak to that, but is it purely from the financial arrangement, right? A lot of us may be approached by a solar provider so that the CREF allows the off-taker for the subscription of off-takers off-site, and in doing so, the site owner doesn't, it's a financial arrangement, right? So that we're not paying the upfront expense. And that I know is certainly the path that some have taken to get solar on the site. And that's unrelated to the size of the house account, correct?
Yeah.
Has anyone done that? Essentially, where they're getting off-site subscribers in order to facilitate the financing of the solar project?
Well, I do know. I'll just speak. I know I know for Solar for All. So the Solar for All funding requires, I understand it requires that to get additional funding through the Solar for All program above and beyond what the SREC provides, you have to have all of your subscribers be low income or low moderate income users. And so if you're in a mixed use multifamily building, you put a CREF on, you would have to have some of the subscribers, and you wanted to do it as a Solar for All project. Some of the subscribers would have to be on site, and others would have to be off site, in order to be able to use that program.
I don't think that's actually accurate, Marshall. I think the Solar for All, I believe so. The Solar for All, I think 100% of the off-takers have to be lower or moderate income, but you can actually have it doesn't have to be, none of the subscribers actually have to be on site.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to imply that some of them had to be. I meant to imply that some of them might have to be not. But yes, in fact, all of them could be not on site.
Right. Gotcha. Yeah.
Thank you for clarifying.
And the owner of the system isn't responsible for finding these subscribers. That's the Solar for All program itself, who basically provides you with an incentive, basically capital to install the solar, and then you basically have the agreement is that you give them all the energy for free, and then they sell that to or however it is the structure is to low and moderate income folks. So you get an upfront capital infusion, and then you don't get anything for the actual electricity that's produced from the system. But the incentive is quite I think it's like $1 a watt or something like that. So it's pretty significant.
Hey guys, this is Sharon. I just wanted to open it up a little bit more to non-task force members. Since the chat box is so quiet, if you'd like to unmute yourself and join the conversation, let's try it. And if we have too many people talking at once, then we can always kind of go back to the chat box. But feel free to unmute and but introduce yourself as you start speaking so we can understand who it is for note-taking purposes. Go ahead.
Hi, this is Shelley Cohen from the DCSEU's Solar for All program. So I'm really, thank you for having me here today. I'm not a member of the task force, but I'm really excited to listen in on this particular meeting. I apologize, I may not have heard the question fully, but with regard to the portion of the Solar for All program that the DCSEU is working on, we currently, you were correct, we currently offer an incentive, an upfront incentive, and then all of the output from the facilities that are installed, all of the output goes to low-income residents across the district. The output from the projects is directed to DOEE. So DOEE essentially has oversight over and manages all of the output from these CREF facilities, and they direct the solar, so they have their own subscriber management program, and they direct the solar to the subscribers. So they work with building owners across the city to sign up subscribers for their program. Each subscriber receives roughly about 3.5 kilowatts of solar, and which offsets roughly about 50% of their utility spend.
Thank you, Shelley, for that. That was helpful. Does anyone else have any other feedback or comments or concerns that they want to voice?
I have a question, if I may. Does DOE track who, I assume there must, by definition, track who is subscribing at, what locations, but I'm wondering how easy it would be for a building owner to find out, how many subscribers and thus how much energy is being subscribed to from, if at all, from the building where the CREF sits. Because if you're in a situation, whether it's solar for all or not, if you're in a situation wherein you can't put a NEM on, and then you don't have that option, and you put a CREF on, for the users who are getting that energy within the building, technically it's in front of the meter, yes, but electrons, like water, follow the shortest path. So it's going to go from that CREF, it's going to go directly, some of it at least, in theory, some of those electrons go directly to the building, and people in the building are getting that credit. And I'm wondering whether it'd be possible, I realize it'd be a deviation from guidance, but would it be possible to have the ability to discount your reported energy for the portion of a CREF that is being used within that site? Like there's a policy question there, but also just technologically, in terms of sort of data access and tracking, is that data easily accessible?
This is Jessica Jones. Marshall, that's a good question, because that was actually something that our company's thinking about with our affordable housing properties in DC. So.
I'm happy to shed some light onto this. This is Shelley Cohen again from the DCSEU. With regard to the CREF program that we're overseeing, as I mentioned, DOEE receives all of the output, and then they take responsibility for signing up subscribers. So each subscriber to their program has to apply, and then they make sure that they are income qualified subscribers to the program, so that they do qualify as low income. I know, and I haven't sort of seen what their process is, because it's separate from our process. We're responsible at the DCSEU for helping get the projects implemented and installed. But I know that they're keeping very good records of who actually signs up to be a subscriber in their program. And then once the subscriber is approved, the name is given to PEPCO, and they get a credit on their bill based on their being a subscriber to the program. So I'm sure that a list
Welcome
exists.
to Blue Jeep.
And I'm not sure how they how they are working with that list, but I know that the record keeping is very good.
Hi, this is Alex. My colleagues in the energy admin at DOEE manage the handle the subscriber management process. But what I will say about that is, so they collect the accounts and the names and they send it off to PEPCO, and PEPCO does credit the bills through. PEPCO has a portal that it uses to manage subscribers. Those names and addresses and account numbers are PII, that is private information. We are not able to share that publicly.
So a building owner wouldn't be able to find out who in the building is subscribed to it, and they wouldn't have any ability to sort of enlist their own residents in the building to subscribe.
I don't know about the second part of that question, but the first part of that question is that no, DOE is not able to share personally identifiable information about the benefits of certain programs, such as Solar for All.
Are you also tracking the, sort of just to tease something out here, it's sounding to me like this is sort of a giant pool where you have a bunch of CREF inputs coming in and a bunch of off-takers coming out, but it's not necessarily that a given off-taker is being tracked as coming from a given CREF system. Is that true, or is that link tracked?
It is tracked. An off-taker will have a certain amount of a system, so it might be, say, like 3.5 kilowatts of a system are designated as being associated with a subscriber.
Got it. But it's all based on sort of just an output kilowatt. It's not based on the actual output of that CREF system.
It is based on the actual output of the system that the subscriber is associated with. Oh,
so it's a portion. Okay, so when you say the kilowatt, that's just describing the portion of the total capacity. And then
they will get a percentage of the total output based on their subscription to a portion of the project.
Okay. Are there any CREFs being done that aren't Solar for All, that where like a building owner says, I want to see if all of the residents in my building or all of the retail tenants in my complex can subscribe to the CREF that's on my building? I know that's happening in other jurisdictions, and I've advised on some of that, but I don't know to what extent that's happening here.
I believe it is. I believe there are some non-Solar for All CREFs. I think it is a minority. Someone else could correct me on that. And I don't necessarily know how, the subscription then is not done through us. They have their own process for that.
This is Jay. Just anecdotally, I am a subscriber to a CREF, but I'm not an income-based subscriber. So I subscribe directly through Groundswell. So I know that it does happen, but I don't know the other details that you're asking about, Marshall.
Okay.
Marshall, you asked a question about, this is Shelley Cohn from DCSEU. You asked a question about whether or not there are efforts to sign up individual subscribers from the buildings where the CREF is located. Mm-hmm. And I will say that DOEE is putting in substantial efforts to work with the building and site owners to first provide education about what it means to be a part of the program, and then to also sign up subscribers. And certainly before COVID, they were able to go into buildings and set up a nice kiosk where they could talk to building owners directly. So now they're getting a little bit more innovative. They're sending out cards and trying to reach residents in other manners. But, it does create a little bit more of a challenge. But there is a lot of effort on the part of DOEE to work closely with the site owners to make sure that their residents do receive the opportunity to become subscribers in the program.
Matt or Annika, do you guys have any other thoughts soon? Or Marshall, do you have any other thoughts?
Yeah, I guess to shift gears here a little bit, if we can go to the page that's the summary of the NEM systems in the district, I guess
Yeah.
I'd like to test or see what others think on. I guess the underlying logic here is that I guess I have no concerns about how the treatment of net energy meter systems is being handled here with DOE's proposed position, but the logic here seems to be that it's relatively marginal, so therefore the CREF systems are not being do not experience a disadvantage. I think I said that in a very roundabout way.
No, it makes sense.
And so it does seem to me like there could be a particular class of building owners who are largely left in this bucket to only pursue solar through CREF and are not receiving the same benefit through BEPS that those with net systems do. And I guess I push back on a couple of the bullet points here that say that the impacts are marginal. So when we say only a handful are, so it has about a 3-point impact your Energy Star score. Not a big number, but it is not nothing when we start to think about how much each point distance from the target costs in fine. 3 points could add up to a significant amount of money and could be significant enough to justify considering a solar system when taken in total with the additional incentives. And second, I would just point out that I think it's not quite accurate to view this entirely in terms of it only provides 3 points, and therefore owners wouldn't be pursuing this to comply with BEPS. We think about the most cost-effective measure, right, to get each bucket of points. So say we need to close a gap of 10 points, we're going to look at what does it cost to get the first 4, and that could be lighting and VFDs, and then what does it cost to get the next and the next. And so the 3 points on its own certainly isn't like mind-blowing, but when will it be a factor and one we want, I think, to be available to all property types as something in their toolbox seems like something to consider.
Hey, and this is Jen from DGS, and hopefully Roger from DLR Group, who's our consultant for creating the strategic energy management plan, is on the line. I know he had to jump off at some point. And so Roger, if you are on the line, feel free to jump in.
Sure, I'm on. Yep.
Oh, great. I'll just provide the overarching result, and if you want to dig in, please feel free. But DLR Group did some analysis on DGS's portfolio. We anticipate installing about 10 megawatts in the next couple of years of additional solar on our buildings. And it actually would make quite a difference for BEPS compliance, where it would get us about 15% closer toward compliance on a portfolio level. So actually, in our case, where we have about 300 buildings that need to be in compliance, it would be quite significant. And then I'm just looking at the first bullet, the 70 net energy meterings on benchmark buildings. We have about 40 to 50 buildings that are net metered. So I'm wondering if the majority of those are those of DGS. But anyways,
Jen,
yeah.
This is Andrew. I think you weren't on the call when I first covered this slide, but I wanted to acknowledge both those points because I did acknowledge them earlier. 67% of those 70 systems are K through 12 schools, and we assume those to be DGS.
Okay.
And then I did point out earlier that that median does include K through 12 schools in it, and generally we've found pretty much the same outcome, that K through 12 schools do see a higher point value, likely because they have more roof space. But even with that even with that spread, the median still comes out to 3 points.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Roger, are you able to, or would you like to share any more about your analysis?
Yeah, sure. And this is really, we're looking at this from an order of magnitude standpoint, taking a look at the total current energy consumption of the DGS portfolio, and then looking at the current properties that are below the median Energy Star score or the below the median national median EUI. And right now we're working through building type by building type based on 2019 data. Hopefully that will be available soon. So this will be a more calibrated number in just a few short weeks. But at least taking that as a rough pass, if I took 20% of that total portfolio energy use and then contrasted that against the 10 megawatts of proposed solar over, I think, Jen, we discussed maybe the next 5 years in this first compliance cycle, that is roughly about 15% of that 20% reduction that would need to be targeted. So it is actually a fairly sizable chunk. I think we've had discussions, Andrew, on a call we had last week about really making sure we don't lose sight of building efficiency with what this standard is about. But I think one of the things we're seeing is that for DGS, the way that project scope is controlled and the timing of it, that perhaps in this first compliance cycle, the contribution of solar may actually have a bigger impact and ability to give some flexibility for reducing overall portfolio in a strategic way over the next 15 years. Because there are some things that are already, I think, pre-planned that may not be influenced enough by what's happening with the discussion in this team, as well as the work that we're doing on this management plan for DGS.
And Roger, I want to thank you for that. That's really useful information. I'm going to draw something out here for people, for everyone's following us. In the last meeting, DOE talked about the standard target pathway only being available to property types above the median. That does not include K through 12 schools. So as currently laid out, this, even though this would provide a major benefit to the K through 12 schools, as Roger's just saying, DGS portfolio, but primarily schools, those schools would actually not be able to count the solar toward at all because they wouldn't be eligible for the standard target pathway. DOE, correct me if I'm wrong in that, but that's my understanding, and I think it's a point of some concern.
And I think, and thank you, Roger and Marshall, and just from the DGS perspective, and obviously we don't want to monopolize this, I think considering this recent analysis that was done and the impact it could have and like the limited dollars we're dealing with, especially with the recession, I think DGS would like DOE to consider at least including solar in the first compliance cycle, not necessarily the cycles after that, but just as a consideration.
In this analysis y'all did, are you doing it sort of in the context of the city's broader climate goals and the efficiency targets that DGS would need to meet to be able to hit those? Or is it done just in the context of complying with BEPS in the first round?
Complying with BEPS in the first round to start, because right now we are looking at a variety of. Oh, sorry.
Okay, so sorry, I interrupt you, but as I said, I'm not taking into consideration the broader energy targets that DGS would be needing to meet to get our city where we need to be in terms of energy reductions and our climate goals.
Yeah, this is, I think that's just one part of what we're looking at because we are also looking at deep energy retrofit strategies. But really, it's a timing question of that overlay of whether to do. Because I think every modernization right now is fairly aggressive on the K through 12 side. We're trying to craft something consistent and support DGS in that. But I think it's all the properties that may not be up for a major modernization within this first compliance cycle that we are looking at this kind of a portfolio scale to allow for some more flexibility. So there isn't this need to necessarily renovate every single building that's not complying. All right, so it could be a total energy savings across the portfolio to meet compliance, but not necessarily at an individual building level. And so that's thinking of this as a portfolio. That's where some recent discussions have come up about the contribution of renewables.
So in the modernization schedule, Jen, will DGS be looking to use the schools that are undergoing a modernization? Will they be going after efficiency in those situations to comply with BEPS?
Right. Yeah. So I think that's what the
Where you do
strategic.
have control.
Right. Yep. So the strategic energy management plan is going to make those recommendations as pathways for BEPS compliance. But I think what Roger is referring to is a lot of the modernizations over the next several years. The budget, and in some cases, the design has already been set by council and the mayor's office and everyone. So it's hard to change those. And this is a six-year capital improvement plan that's planned way in advance, so that it'll be easier to change the design of buildings further out beyond the next few years. And Roger, feel free to chime in.
On those modernizations as they're set, have they been anticipating the changes in codes, including the one that drafted, or the future codes, taking into account the comprehensive energy plan and the net zero targets that we have by 2026, including the green code?
Yeah, I mean, I think with some of these codes just being released, they're going to need to modify as they go. But in some cases, it can be difficult when they've already completed design or the budget's already been established.
I mean, and I ask because, the comprehensive energy plan was released years ago when Marshall was at DOE, and so we've known where we want to be for quite a while. So it should have been taken into account.
Yeah, just to jump in. Yeah, I think from what we have observed is actually the modernization program has been aggressive and keeps in mind the broader DC goals. I think one I probably wasn't clear. It's actually all the buildings that are not slated for modernization in this first compliance cycle. It's that inverse of it is how to achieve that by. I think one of the things is to actually be very aggressive with any modernization that's done, because we're already going to see probably about a 50% improvement in energy use intensity from a pre-renovation condition at minimum with those projects, just following the current DC energy and green code that just went into act. And then even beyond that, because of a LEED certification pathway, usually teams will be targeting another 20% or so beyond the model standard 90.1 2010 or 2013. And so I think it's the other projects that aren't up for this major modernization that may not be complying is trying to find a way to not force them to just do some measure that's not going to get to 20%, and then may be something that it gets reversed or eliminated in when it does go through a major modernization. And we're still fairly early in our evaluation, so we don't have a complete picture of the number of buildings that are way below the Energy Star median and when they're due for a modernization. That's something we're actually cross-mapping right now to take a look at.
It would be useful to know that, because I think it's worth, there are sort of two solutions to this problem. One is to have a alternative compliance path that sort of is an alternative performance path that does count solar to some extent. And then the other is to allow buildings to meet the standard target pathway regardless of property type, as opposed to limiting it to some property types. Both would sort of allow DGS or other portfolio owners in a similar situation. And I would say there's a lot of owners who do long-term planning and have large portfolios, and a lot of multifamily owners with very limited budgets for whom, in the very long term, they may want to do really deep renovations, but in the next few years, it may not be feasible for all of the properties, and solar can provide that solution in the shorter term and get them part of the way there. And they still might have to comply next cycle and then do a deeper renovation then, but it could help now.
Yeah, so what I'm hearing from Roger is that the modernizations are going to be taking efficiency seriously and are going to be thinking about the current codes, but also the ones we're talking about 6 years, I think is what y'all mentioned in the capital outlays. We'll be taking that seriously. And then as other sort of money funds come shake loose, as they tend to do year to year, those would be taking that seriously too. On the efficiency side of things, because I mean, I think using the logic that we're talking about right here is like modernizations are opportunity to do efficiency, and anything in between can only be solar as like some sort of add-on. Like I think in that situation, all modernizations need to be hitting high levels of deep energy retrofit. Period. Otherwise, it's a small window that once it's passed over, it's passed over. So like some of this kind of feels to me to be falling under some sort of like hardship situation where something's not slated for modernization, i.e. doesn't have budget, and that is more of a one-off situation, especially, Roger, to your point, that you don't know what's falling under or below, that kind of stuff at this point in time, regardless. Yes, and so it's like, yeah, anyways, but I think Jen, it'd probably be good to, talk more about this, and
Just sort of
Sorry, I joined a little late, but I've been here for this conversation. Yeah, I think it'd be great if we could talk a little bit more offline, Roger and Jen, about this.
Oh, sure. That would be great. Yeah. Thanks, Annika.
I think this is helpful, but to broaden just beyond DGS, I still think that, yes, you could say it's a hardship situation, but when you have enough of a hardship situations and you have a systemic solution that could address them in allowing solar to have a role, I think it's worth considering. The other thing I just want to say, as we talk about the trade-off between solar and efficiency, is I want to challenge the idea that was laid out earlier that every solar installation put on a building is a loss in GHG savings because all of that solar was going to happen anyway under the RPS, regardless whether or not it happened on that building. And I think that assumes two things. One, it assumes that we're going to hit the 10% solar carve-out, which actually I think is not a given the amount, the economic potential in DC, and in fact one could argue is by design. The only reason SREC prices are as high as they are is because of the solar carve-out not being met. And when the solar carve-out was increased by 5 to 10%, it was in part done because solar developers were concerned that the carve-out would be hit and then SREC prices will be dropped. So by design, so they went and changed it. And it's reasonable to think that when we get close, people are going to try to change it again. So I think by design, the solar carve-out may never actually be met, and that's kind of the point, for better or worse. Secondly, in DOE's modeling, non-solar renewables outside DC get discounted, whereas solar does not. So more solar installed. So it's not a given that a solar installed in DC doesn't actually help us because that RPS will deliver that regardless. It's not a given it'll happen in DC, and if it doesn't happen in DC, it doesn't necessarily provide the same GHG benefit because of additionality issues. So this is a somewhat esoteric point, but it's actually a very concrete point about this question of the whole idea that we shouldn't look at solar is rooted in part because the idea that we need to go is that the solar counts against efficiency in all cases and doesn't provide it and counts against the total GHG savings the city will see. And I don't actually know that that's a safe assumption.
Hi, this is Alex from DOE. I'll take a crack at responding to that, but any of my colleagues obviously feel free to jump in. I think when we think about meeting the solar carve-out, it is absolutely, a bit of a tall order, but what we see as absolutely fundamental to getting close to that is major energy demand reduction. And so I don't think it's, we're not thinking of like all solar in the district is a missed opportunity to do demand reduction, but every missed demand reduction is kind of a missed opportunity to help us get closer to that solar carve-out because we have a smaller base of energy consumption that we're dealing with. So that's what we were talking about. And then the concept of additionality is something we go back and forth about constantly and all the time. And For yes, like greenhouse gas inventory protocols, that's an ongoing discussion about how we should frame that. But in the context of the RPS itself, that is part of the 100% RPS. Those outside DC Tier 1 resources do count 100% towards the RPS.
Mm-hmm.
And this is Edward and from DOEE, and I guess just to dovetail on what Alex said, I mean, to make a very high point, and this high level point is just really about it really is a strategic importance and significance in really focusing first on demand reduction rather than, and not conflating the issue of supply measure as a greenhouse gas reduction device or greenhouse gas reduction measure versus energy efficiency as a greenhouse gas reduction measure. Those two are not the same thing. We often talk about them as same thing. We often treat them as same thing. They absolutely are not the same. In what the climate sees, in what the pocketbook sees. So just to take a very high level sort of back of the envelope figure calculation, if we didn't really do the demand reduction that's envisioned in our codes and in BEPS, then the total amount of renewable or clean electricity that we would have to buy by 2040 or 2045 would be equivalent to building a new nuclear power plant unit or something like 2 gigawatt of solar farm. That's how much these programs really mean and how much significance they carry. So I think this group certainly, I'm sure, are very well aware of that. I just wanted to just emphasize that point.
Thanks, Edward.
Matt, it looks like you were going to say something.
Yeah, no, I think that's a point well made, and one I would advise you to communicate more and more often. I'd say I think we've talked about before what will likely happen for many of us as we get our first BEPS scorecard or however it's communicated, and you find out you're not in compliance. I think for many of us back at our offices, many of the questions we're going to get is, should we go install solar? And to respond to that with some equivocation and say, yes, sort of, it gives us some benefit, but it's incremental. It's not like reducing those kilowatt hours for us, will be something we have to communicate a lot to our stakeholders to help them understand that that's not like the first step in complying with BEPS. And so to the extent we're all working towards achieving those same outcomes, making that case much more clearly that it's sort of an orders of magnitude more required in demand reduction than in sort of a fuel switch to green power, I think is really unknown or is not well understood right now. So that'll really be necessary as going forward.
That's a very good point. In education, we need to make sure that we're stating the right things when we educate and making sure that the efficiency, that we communicate well about this is an efficiency program and make sure we take language into account when we're educating people on the program. So that makes total sense. So thank you. And I think that point has become solidified a little bit more through this conversation and all the feedback we've gotten, and for us for DOEE to be able to talk about their position, all of this conversation and feedback has been very helpful in solidifying, the program and its needs and the needs of the district and all of that kind of stuff. So does anybody have any other thoughts? We might wrap up the conversation early.
I want to ask a question of the room. When we first talked about solar, which was 2 months ago now, at least.
Probably in January, but yes.
Well, the incident I'm talking about, thinking about, I think was the end of April, the beginning of May. And
Okay.
I made the argument that I thought solar should count towards the performance path, a argument that DOE disagrees with, and that clearly we've continued to, discuss. There was broad agreement in the task force at the time that in principle, without going into a lot of these details, that was the case, that solar was important and should be able to be counted more broadly. And I think we now have a really good understanding of DOE's position, and we've heard from a few people, but I don't have a good sense of what the view of the task force is, and members of the task force beyond myself and a couple other people, in terms of how solar should be treated. Like, is this position that DOE is laying out acceptable to people, or do you think that it's important that solar be counted?
Just real quick, guys, if you want to put something in the chat box, you don't have to say anything out loud. Let's use the chat box, and I'll let Marshall finish your thought. I'm sorry.
Oh, I was just inviting people to talk, which they can, yes, purely do by the chat box instead if you want. I'm not exactly calling for a vote here because I don't have something so simple as a vote, but I wanted to get a broader sense of whether people thought this position from DOE was acceptable, or whether it was important that solar, and maybe we'll zero in on NEM systems, be able to be counted towards the performance path, or for the standard target pathway for all building types, et cetera. Some of these issues that we've been talking about here today specifically.
And I would also say, if you want to take more time to think about this and reply afterwards, that's fine too. It's not a necessarily, Marshall, I think, to right now push.
Yeah, I'm not trying to say speak now or forever hold your peace. I'm just trying to invite more talking. I've done a lot of talking, and my mouth is tired.
Yeah, and Marshall, I'm glad you brought that up, because I was actually wondering the same thing, and I'm primarily kind of looking to other building owners that'll be impacted the most by this. I'd just be curious, like I know Matt, and I'm not sure how Joe feels, but how you guys are approaching this conversation.
I think candidly, I mean, our first glance is that we're in a position where the solar considerations are likely not impacting our ability to comply in the first phase, but could become more material in as more buildings or having to make more substantial, depending on how solar is treated, that it becomes more important for us down the road. So for those reasons, it sort of takes requiring a longer look, and I don't know that we're totally set on that as we sit here today.
I just want to kind of chime in here and reiterate that the point of the 2023 study for greenhouse gas emissions is going to focus on that point also, about how solar interplays, because that obviously does have a determinable greenhouse gas impact. And so we'll study that outcome for future cycles.
This is Cliff. If I could speak to that, say I'm glad that you're doing that. I think that's very important. One thing to keep in mind is the sort of changing nature of the grid. In California, they have something called the duck curve, which many of you may have heard of, which is the shape of the load. And what happens is when they have a lot of electricity being generated from solar, they can sometimes have a situation in the middle of the day where they're curtailing solar. They're actually turning off solar panels because it can't be used. And obviously, we want for the whole country, the whole world to follow suit in terms of using more and more solar and wind. And so the time that electricity is used is going to be really important. So as you do the study for greenhouse gases, I hope that you'll look at using hourly conversion factors so that people get rewarded for using electricity when there's lots and lots of solar and wind on the grid, and rewarded for not using electricity when we're having to burn fossil fuels to provide that electricity, or when we're potentially hitting peak situations and might have to invest billions or many billions of dollars into the grid to prevent blackouts, especially in the context of electrifying vehicles and transportation.
That is an excellent point, Cliff, and duly noted. I think this is also something that has been captured in DOE's thinking around grid modernization or electrification studies. Not to put Alex back on the spot.
Yes. We have a grant from Department of Energy to look at an electrification roadmap and phasing strategy for the district that includes modeling efficiency of buildings and transportation and then electrification of buildings and transportation. And part of that study is to do hourly grid emission factor modeling so that we can start to plan for those things now. So that is underway.
That's great, and that will produce the hourly factors by the 2023 deadline for the greenhouse gas study that's required by the Clean Energy DC Act, right?
Can I ask Edward to answer this question?
I'm sorry, I actually couldn't quite. You broke off a little bit, Cliff. Would you mind just repeating it really quickly?
I'm thrilled about the electrification roadmap and that you all are leading on it, and it's really farsighted. It's great that you got the DOE funding for it. I'm wondering if it will generate hourly emissions factors in time for inclusion in the study of using greenhouse gases as the metric for BEPS, which is required by the Clean Energy DC Act by 2023.
Yeah, I'm certainly hoping to have at least some preliminary findings of that at the end of this summer.
Great, thank you.
And really just real quickly, on Cliff's point about this curtailment of solar too, it's already happening in DC because the PEPCO will sometimes say, well, you may have a contract that says you have, and the system that's designed to output from a 2 megawatt or 1 megawatt facility, but we can't use all of it, so you gotta shut that off during these hours, and that's already happening and something we're struggling with. That's more of an FYI, but just sort of following that point that Cliff made.
Well, good to know. Do any other task force members have some final thoughts, or you're welcome to email us directly in the DOE office, or Katie, do you have some final thoughts? Let's have any other task force members have any other final thoughts on solar, or anybody else from the audience? Now, Katie, do you want to say any wrap up from DOE? I know you weren't here when we actually presented all the information at the beginning. I just wanted to give you an opportunity to say anything, or you can say no.
No, I think I joined sort of late, so I don't know what all was said. But I'm glad that we were able to sort of at least get our position out there and get your feedback. And if anyone else has more feedback and they want to send it our way, they can. I think from our standpoint, we don't feel like anything we're doing is taking anything away from anyone. This was meant to be an efficiency first program from the beginning. And we've actually built in more flexibility to allow solar to benefit buildings through the standard target pathway. So that's we put that in there. That wasn't in there originally. And so I think that generally that's sort of where we're coming at with this. And I'm, interested to hear more if anybody has other thoughts that they haven't brought up on the call to continue the conversation.
Okay, thank you. Okay, and we will go ahead and wrap up the meeting a little early. Our next meeting is July 21st, same time. We'll start off with a subcommittee update from the campus subcommittee. We're going to spend about 20-30 minutes talking about the High Performance Building Hub, getting an update from them, and they have a request for some feedback from the task force. We're going to talk a little bit about BEPS disclosure of data. We actually do this with our benchmarking data, but there is nothing in the law that talks about BEPS disclosure of data, so we wanted to talk about that with the task force. There may also be those are the three things that are definitely on the agenda. There may be a possibility that we may talk about our guidance document about delay of compliance if we get it closer to finished by then. And we may also possibly add in a little bit about the cost benefit study, but those two are still up in the air. So those, we will know more about that about a week from now as to whether or not those are going to make it to the agenda. Does anybody have any questions about July 21st? Then I'll open up the floor for announcements.
I have an announcement. I'll put it in the chat box as well, but I am tomorrow at 1, this is Marshall, tomorrow at 1 p.m. along with Jules from DCSCU and Chris Penley from Boland. We're giving a presentation for USGBC National Capital Region on BEPS compliance and how to exceed BEPS compliance using the ASHRAE 100 pathway as a way of targeting your setting a performance target and figuring out how to achieve it. It's partially targeted at people who haven't been paying as close attention to, so certainly my section of it is targeted at people who haven't been paying attention to task force meetings. But I think even folks who have been paying attention to the meetings will find a lot to learn from the discussion of ASHRAE 100 at the meeting. So I'll put a link in the chat box here, but that's tomorrow webinar at 1 p.m.
Yeah, and if anybody can't get this link very quickly, we actually put this link in the last round of notes from June 23rd. So if you want to point anybody to our BEPS task force notes from June 23rd, the notes are also have that link in there also. Any other announcements?
I just want to say something. I just presented on a BOMA panel with Ben Myers from Boston Properties, and I just want to say that I've been sort of talking to him a little bit over the last couple of weeks in preparation for the presentation, and he only had great things to say about our task force. And he was saying that he thought that the process here in DC in developing our BEPS policy has been really, really great from what he's seen, and he thinks that the process that we have of working together, all of us on the task force together and the public sector working hand in hand with the private sector on this, he thinks has been really, really great. And he had only had complimentary things to say about all of us and all the work that we're doing. So I just wanted to pass that along as a compliment to all of you and the work that we're doing together.
I'll add that I've spoken to a number of New York building owners who are envious of the process in DC. They feel like the DC process has been much smoother and more collaborative working with the building owners as compared to the New York Local Law 97 process. And they would like to see 97 move in the direction of DC BEPS.
That's awesome. Thank you, both of you. Any other announcements? Okay, then we'll call it early and give everyone 23 minutes back to their day. Thank you, everyone. 30th, and then when you're in the Eventbrite, you can actually sign up for all of the different webinar updates. Does anybody have any questions? Oh, okay. So we wanted to talk just for a few minutes about the task force report and the framework that we're working on. We've been working with the co-chairs to figure out kind of the best framework that's going to work for the task force report. And what we're going to do from the DOEE side is actually kind of write out a draft and then work with maybe a small group of task force members to do edits and kind of get it ready to release at the same time that at least a task force report version 1 or phase 1 that will come out at the same time as the draft rules. so that people, when are looking at the draft rules and looking at the guidance documents, they'll be able to refer to one report that came out of the task force of how all of our discussions and feedback and information that you guys have discussed have then influenced the draft rules, and they'll be able to see that, a lot of the analysis and the discussion. So what we were going to do at the framework of the report is have an executive summary of all the recommendations, but then get into topic-specific outlines or bullet points of each section, like the standard target pathway or penalties or historical preservation, the conversation we had on that. So we'll have them broken out by conversations or by topics, where we'll have a summary of the topic, the task force recommendations and outcomes. Then we'll go into a little bit more in depth talking about analysis and discussion that was done, and then a quick listing of which meetings the topic was actually discussed at, so that if they do want to go back to our website and say, oh, this was discussed on June 23rd, I want to see those original notes, they could click on it and actually go to that particular note. So what we wanted to do was, we definitely don't want to edit the report with all 17 people. I think that's just going to be a little bit too big of a process to think about, but maybe think about creating maybe a smaller committee that could work with DOEE on edits and framework and that kind of thing. Marshall or Matt, do you guys or Annika want to add anything to that?
I'll just say, I mean, seeing the quick draft that I've seen, we like, the outline makes sense. I think the distinction to make right now is whether or not there are folks who want involvement in the structure and outline and how the content will be drafted. And then at a later point, I think there's another time to get engaged and focus on what the report says the task force recommendations and outcomes are, such that we all feel comfortable that it appropriately represents what we've been discussing before sort of any publication. So that's just a distinction I think we're getting at with where we are or where DOEE is in the process of drafting.
That's true, and I think it's good to note if there is we're working internally to have this draft report and the guidance documents done by the end of August, with the chance that the draft rules maybe come out at the end of, we're not sure exactly what the timeline is for the draft rules, but we're working internally so that if they are ready by the end of August, all of the other documentation would be ready at the same time, so that it may happen, involvement in a draft of this report may happen sooner rather than later, maybe within the next couple of weeks. So if anybody wants to be involved, you're welcome to put your name in the chat box so that we can reach out when we're ready to do that. And it may be on the August 4th meeting, we may be soliciting a small group of people to help us with edits and draft. Does anybody have any questions or thoughts on the framework? You know, with silence, I take that as agreement. So this is your opportunity. Okay. So for our next meeting, we are actually still working on the topics of exactly what's going to be ready within our guidance documents and the cost benefit study to be able to talk on August 4th. So we will keep you updated on what's planned for that. We know we'll at least have a subcommittee update from the campus subcommittee. We are pretty sure a conversation on the cost benefit study is going to happen, but we have to double check and make sure. We think that the criteria around the alternative compliance path might be ready for some feedback on August 4th. But if it's only these three things, we may make it a shorter meeting and by about 3:30. We'll see in our work behind the scenes if there's any other guidance documents or anything else that we can do feedback on. We may also reach back out to the Green Bank to see if they need a feedback session. There's some other ideas that are possibly up for this particular agenda. Does anybody have any questions about the next meeting? We'll send out a little bit more, because we don't have it set, we'll send out a little bit more firm update once we get it set. Okay. Are there any announcements? Sounds like there are no announcements. Well, then we are going to let everybody go 15 minutes early today. Hope everybody has a good evening. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Well.